Welcome to the Monday Monologue. Well, today I want to go over a question that I get asked a lot. What is a good project to do as your first project? And I'm going to back up and assume that this person has no fabrication skills or have never done any kind of fabrication work, and that maybe have limited soldering skills and probably don't know how to read a schematic and never done anything like this before. And if that sounds like you, don't take on something like a 300B amp or even one of these like a 6SQ7 or even a 6BM8 amp. And of course I'm not going to call this person out by name, but somebody attempted to build my 6BM8 amp as their first project. And I know I said, this is a beginner's project or whatever, but I really didn't think that through. It's not an easy amp to build. And they clearly were having issues with soldering, and their fabrication skills were pretty weak. And, they kind of threw their hands up and they asked me if they could send it to me to fix it, because it's like I hate that I bought these parts and I had good intentions, but it just didn't pan out. And so I agreed. He sent it to me. Ended up having to tear the whole all the components out of the inside of it, redo some of the fabrication stuff, get the jacks to mount right. There was some issues with all of that stuff and how the volume control, they drilled the volume control hole wrong and stuff and had to shim it up with washers and whatever. And a couple $100 of my time later, got a nice working 6BM8 amp, sent it back to him. Not something I'd want to do on a regular basis by any means, and I'm not advertising that service here at all. But the guy sent a very compelling email, felt sorry for him, and decided, yeah, let me fix this up for you. So anyway, the point of all of that is that was probably too big a project for somebody to take on as their first one. So if you've never done this kind of work before, build this little headphone adapter box. I'll put the link in the description below. It's an inexpensive project to build. And even if you're not a headphone user, you can get some earbuds or something to test it with. And not, $20 or $30, you can get something to test it with. And then on the back, it's got jacks to hook it up to your amplifier. And this is a great first project. It's a cheap little box. It's got a volume pot, switch, a couple of headphone jacks. There's 2 power resistors inside it and some output jacks. And this is going to give you a good feel for what fabricating up a chassis is like. And don't need a lot of tools. You can get some sort of an electric drill. It can even be a corded one. I use a cordless one just because I've got one, but I've also got a corded drill here I use sometimes for bigger holes, but not a big investment. You can get a little set of drill bits. You might have to buy some specific ones that fit the sizes, like the little shims that are on these speaker jacks so they're not grounded to the chassis. And then you're going to need some sort of a soldering iron. I love this Heiko unit. I'll put the link below on it too. Comes with a little stand and a cleaner and a sponge and this temperature controller. You want a temperature controlled soldering iron, and I'll try to put a link below to a less expensive Heiko unit that maybe doesn't have this big temperature controller but is just a pencil iron. But that's all you need. And if you totally screw up the little chassis because it's so small, these are really cheap. And you just go, okay, learn from my mistake. Let me order another chassis. And if you can build one of these and you can follow the simple schematic of, through the switch and through the pot and how this all works, and then wire it up from that, that's going to be a good learning experience on reading schematics too. And there's, fairly easy soldering inside this, but there is, quite a few solder joints you have to make. And it'll give you some good practice soldering. And if you can make something and it ends up looking like this one, then you're well on your way to being a DIY from scratch builder. The other thing that's probably the next step, honestly, is one of these EAR 834 clone things that I've done 2 different video series on. So you can watch all those videos, read it on my website. These boards are available on eBay. Again, not a big investment. Now, when you start buying like the capacitors and you're buying, nice Mundorf caps, $100 worth of Mundorf caps in it, and then you got to buy the transformer and all that stuff. If you follow my little thing, you can have several $100s into the actual project. And the fab work, let me grab one of these down from the shelf. The fab work's not super complicated, but it's not super easy either. But you just have some, holes here for the jacks. You got holes in the top for the tubes to stick through. You've got a couple of jacks here. You got some holes for the transformer or the switch. And then on the back, you got the IC connector and the holes for the choke. A lot of this stuff is just direct measured off the board, so it's not super complicated, laying it out. If you're going to do one of these, you probably want to get some kind of vernier calipers or measuring tools just to make transferring the measurements onto the chassis easier. But again, this little chassis is fairly cheap. It's an aluminum one, and so if you screw it up, it's not the end of the world. And then at the end of it, when you get it all done, you can paint it or get it powder coated or whatever you want to do and make it your own. And it's a glorious sounding thing to add to your hi-fi system. So there's a couple of fairly easy to do projects. So now I want to talk about kits. And I know a lot of people are like, we want kits. I'd love to buy a kit. I don't want to buy an amp. I want to buy a kit. I'm just not going to do kits. I've thought about this back and forth, and I know some people are going to be disappointed, but that's just not what I'm geared up to. And as a trial, I made a kit up of this simple project. Like, I've done 2 long, very detailed video series on this. I also did a complete video about how to go to Mauser and find parts, especially, more complicated parts like capacitors and stuff where you have to look up more than just like finding a resistor. Well, I ended up spending at least an hour on the phone with the guy that I sold the kit to, and everything was in the kit. But I let him go, and I gave him the link on eBay. I had to look up the auction on eBay for him and send him the link. And that was more time than I invested, was, finding the actual auction for him to go buy one of these. And then told him that when you get it, some of the resistors aren't going to be in spec, and you're going to have to go order some. And like for me to do a kit where I've gone through all the parts and hand measured them all and make sure that all the parts that I'm putting in the kit that I'm sending to you, I'm like an hour away from having a completed amp. Because that's a very time-consuming part of the process. Well, anyway, he got all lost in like what resistors and where, which ones are wrong, and then I don't know how to find the resistors. And so I ended up spending probably 20 minutes going through Mauser, cut and pasting links in an email to him, like hand holding him through buying all the resistors that he needed. And then at the end of that, he calls me up and says, yeah, there's 2 little capacitors, these 2 little guys here, I can't find them in the kit. And I'm like, are you sure they're not there? And he swore they're not in there. And I went, I spent probably 2 hours of my time double checking that everything was in the box. But clearly I missed that because it's not my strong suit, this super organizational stuff. So instead of like just going, hey, I've got a deal on this kit. She really helped me out spending, all this time on the phone. I'll just go buy a couple of these capacitors. It's like, well, you need to ship them to me. So then I had to go get those capacitors, find a box, put them in it, go make a label, then, and that ended up spending another hour, hour and a half probably through that process of finding his address and making the label, taking it down, driving down to the post office to drop the box off. And I've ended up with this one kit in probably 2 hours more than it would have taken me to just build the thing and ship it to him and take a loss on the product. And so I can only imagine what's going to happen with a point-to-point wired amplifier that's not just like a PC board where you're just soldering things on that are all labeled on the board. And I get people are different skill sets, but I don't know what skill sets people have. And people are going to tell me, oh yeah, I know I can do this without any help. And then they're calling me up that, this is a problem or that's a problem. And I'm fixing to talk about another reason that I don't want to do kits. And one is I recently built one of these amps and the power transformer was out of spec. Once I got a load, got the amp all completed, was testing the voltage with a load on the transformer, it was about 15 volts too high. I can't test all these transformers in a loaded circuit before I put them in a box. And I can't test the DCR on every choke that gets put into a kit. Or again, going through and double checking all the resistors. And it sounds like that if there's a resistor in the bag that's out of spec, they're going to expect me to mail them replacement ones. And that's not going to be fun. And I'm doing this because I enjoy it. And because it's fun to me. And so, yeah, I'm not doing it. I'm going to say no there. And I've learned as I've gotten older, sometimes you have to learn to say no. And this is one of those times where I'm saying no. Another example, and then we'll think I'll have enough examples why I'm not doing kits. So I got these transformers from Matt at Musical Power Supplies, which he's been great. And we're still kind of working through trying to get the ideal output transformers for this EL34 amp. And at some point we may switch from EdCore to using his stuff. Right now I'm building them with EdCores because I know they're working good and they sound good. But if you recall, I built an amp with a pair of these and I was just like, something just doesn't sound right. I mean, it's actually got less distortion and it's, doing everything it's supposed to, but something just doesn't sound like I think it should. And so I went back to using EdCore stuff and ordered I'm going to have 20 of their output transformers here fairly soon. I've got 10 here, got 10 on the way. And I did order 10 of these from Matt, in addition to the 2 that I initially bought that I built that amp with. So when he was sending me these next batch, he was like, oh, by the way, and I'm sure you caught this, the transformers are labeled wrong, and it says that the red is the B+, the blue-white is the 40% ultralinear, and the blue is the plate, that's kind of the normal coloring convention. And he said, but the way these are wound, the blue is actually the B+ or the high voltage, the blue-white's the ultralinear tap, and the red is the plate. And then I was asking him, so what does that do with the output phase? Because saying that black is 0 and yellow is the 8 ohm, and I want to put it on my scope to double check the way this thing's wired up against these EdCores, but it's probably going to invert the output as well, or the phase of the output, so then the yellow becomes the ground or the common, and the black is the 8 ohm or the positive. But that's probably why they didn't sound like I thought they should. And so, I was a little disappointed because these have a little thicker core than the EdCores, and I was expecting to have a little better bass response. And this gets back to that I'm just not a triode type person. I'm not a real fan of that triode sound. I'm more of an ultra-linear kind of person. I like the snappy, the crispness, just the bass punch. The ultra-linear to me just has a lot more lively sound to it than a triode does. And that's what these sounded like. And it makes sense now because the ultralinear was a 60% tap instead of a 40% tap with those leads reversed. So I need to build another one of these using these wired right after I hook them up to my scope with the signal generator, look at the waveforms, and but that just goes back to, I did think it was kind of funny when he said, well, I'm sure you caught that. Why would I catch that? And why would I assume that, oh, well, these color codes on the transformer is probably not right? So now I've learned I need to start checking that, and before I build an amp or sit down when I get a pile of new transformers to get out my scope and my signal generator and start measuring resistances and looking at the waveforms before I build amps with them, because that could get mixed up. And what if I got a batch of them that the labels are wrong or the color codes are wrong, and I sell them to you guys would never figure that out. Then the amps don't sound good. And if I'm doing that much testing on the front end, they can't be some huge deep discount for an almost built amp where all you have to do is just like a Lego kit. And so, yeah, and I think I've said before too, that's the part I really enjoy. I enjoy sitting down, with some music playing in the background and just populating these boards and just soldering. I mean, to me, it's just so relaxing. Or, building this out and doing the fab work to me is fun. And yeah, anyway, I don't have to give you that many reasons about why I'm doing a kit, but I know so many folks have been following me. We're really anticipating that and maybe waiting around for that to happen. And I'm just going to say that I'm not doing that. And if you want to build one of these yourself, you need to learn how to do fab work. You need to learn how to read schematics. I'm going to put the schematic, the BOM, build videos, step up and buy the parts and build it yourself if you don't want to buy one that's already done. So that's kind of the direction that I'm heading with all this. And again, if you've never done this before, even if you don't really want or need one of these, see if you can build this little guy. Because if you can't build this little guy, you're not going to be able to build a bigger 300B or a EL34 power amp or even a preamp. And this is a good test and a confidence builder. If you can get this built and it works, then you're like, hey, I was able to do that. Now I just need to now I need to learn how to do the IEC socket and a couple other little skills. And this is a little more complicated, and I need to work with high voltage and learn all that safety stuff. And you're not going to know everything just right out of the gate. So some new stuff that's going on. Matt sent me an email. He had to buy some, he's calling them Z11 laminations for a transformer project that he's working on. He's trying to replicate those Dynaco ST35 output transformers, which I've heard are really good output transformers, but they were built on some special iron cores and very specific layering thing that made them do what they do. And so in the process of that, he bought some of these high-end, I think he got them from Japan. It's like the Z11 whatever that is metal, which is supposed to have more permeability or I don't know how to pronounce that word, but I'll put it up here. But yeah, it's supposed to be more magnetic friendly or transmits the flux better or whatever, and you can use less windings to get the same inductance and all the stuff that is into winding output transformers, which is like black art magic that I'm not going to get into trying to understand everything about it. He's pretty sure these are going to be better than these. But first I got to get these built into an amp, wired correctly, and then listen and test those. And then try these out. And I'll probably build an amp with each so I can do back-to-back testing and see if there really is a difference between these two. And I did build a EL34 amp with the ISO FC12 little small output transformers, and it sounds really good. I mean, of course, it's a step up from like the Ed cores, but again, this is all a work in progress, and it's not to say that, you know, the amps I built or going to build with the 8-core transformers don't sound good. It's just, I mean, you have to expect that transformers that retail for $150 are not going to sound as good as ones that retail for $550, $600, or whatever these things do too when you get the shipping and everything included. And so, yeah, I mean, if people want to use those, I'm happy to build an amp with those ISO transformers, but it's just, you're going to have to pay the difference in the price of the parts and the, you know, the extra shipping and all that, because they get shipped from Japan, and shipping transformers from Japan is not cheap. So anyway, there's, you know, some cool stuff to be had with these transformers and stuff. We're still learning, and hopefully we'll get to the bottom of which of this sounds the best, and even then that's subjective. And we may end up still building the, you know, the Ed cores may have a little more leaning towards the triode sound, where these are more, you know, spunky ultralinear sound that people still may personal preference choose one over the other. So anyway, what else we got going on? Iron for KT88 monoblocks. So y'all know I did that KT120 monoblock project. That was kind of a special project, just pretty much for me. I wasn't intending to sell those. It's a ton of work. You know, the chassis were really expensive. I had them outsourced. The chassis were $100, almost $200 a piece. And then by the time you get all the iron and everything, you know, just $2-3 and all in parts of one of those things, you know, or a pair of those things. And then you need a color preamp to drive it with. And so, you know, definitely more of a higher end kind of a thing. And then ran into the problem with the KT120 tubes, not wanting to bias up and having to research and then find these new old stock tubes that were early production, because the late productions will red plate where the early ones don't, and all that mess. And again, there's only one source for the tubes, so there's no real like tube rolling or playing around with that. And so I decided I want to build a pair of KT88 monoblocks that are going to be more, still not going to be cheap, but they're going to be more budget friendly. We're going to step away from the tube rectifier. We're going to go with solid state rectification. We're going to run them at really high voltage. We're going to also use, and that's another reason to get away from the rectifier, was I need to get to a certain voltage level, and the transformers get just exponentially more expensive going up from this. I think these are 750 volt. When you go to the 800 volt ones, it just, like, the price just blows up. And so to get the voltage that I need on the plate, I'm going to have to use a solid state rectifier. And I mean, there may be a possibility that we use a plug-in solid state one. So if you wanted to use a tube rectifier, you could. You know, that's a potential deal that we may get into. But it may be that the size of the chassis that I want to use is going to preclude that. But I've got these Thermionic Lab output transformers that are set up that should work great with a KT88, but it's going to need to be really high voltage because these are wound to a limited milliamp current. Because I was planning on using these on my EL34 amp, but they're physically just too big. So that made me think, let's do a fixed bias, single-ended, ultralinear KT88 monoblocks. And that way we've got super variety of tubes. Probably going to still use that 6EJ7 for a driver because it sounds really good, and there's a whole slew of other tubes that you can roll into the front end as well. And so that may be my high power solution. And at the end of the day, I know 300B amps are really popular, but the tubes are so expensive, and it's so difficult to really get a really good sounding circuit. And I personally I'm not that crazy about how a 300B amp sounds. I honestly like that EL34 with the ISO Tango transformers in some ways more than my 300B amp. And so I don't know if we're going to ever do that either. We might, I don't know. But this sounds more intriguing to me, and it would match well with the color preamp. So that may be our next big product thing, is some KT88 monoblocks. So anyway, I think I've been babbling along. Used up all my time today for the Monday monologue, so hope you're enjoying my channel. If you are, please subscribe, please like the video. Thanks to all you Patreon supporters and other folks that give me donations or send me stuff and send me records and all that stuff. And I was going to do a recommendation on some music, but I kind of ran out of time. If you like the Beatles, just got the new release of the Revolver that was remastered. It's really good. I'll put the link below. So if you're a Beatles fan, pick that up. And that's it for today. We'll see you next week for the Monday Monologue.